sports fans, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I was waiting a little longer because we had, I know, a late service went a little late this morning. It's 2 Sundays in a row. They really do. We need to really have some conversations about that. So before we get started, let's start our class with prayer requests. I have a bad memory, as I think I've mentioned multiple times, so I'm going to write these down so that I don't actually forget them. And if you could share names as well, that'd be super helpful. Your brother, tell me his name again?
My brother-in-law, Brian.
Brother-in-law,
Yeah.
Brian. That's right, I actually remember his name.
That's right. It's spelled with a Y, so it's really hard to remember. He's still in the hospital. Now they're deciding if they're going to move his TPN port because it's not working. It got infected where it was.
Did he have him up here?
He had it up here,
Yeah.
and now they moved it to the inside of his thigh.
Oh, sorry.
And now they're like, we're not sure we like it there. We might move it somewhere else. I'm like, that's tough on somebody, especially in this condition.
Yeah.
They're frustrated.
Who else? Prayer requests. Well, I will add one this week. So, some of you probably were like us. Well, some of you were there also. I had kids at Camp Andina this week, which was a pretty cool thing for me since I went there, 25, 30 years ago also. Now my kids are going there, so it's kind of a neat thing. But I was struck as I was preparing for class this week. And I think it's just because it becomes a little bit mundane over time, but sometimes I forget, parenting for me becomes a little bit more survival than it does on purpose, and which I'm sure probably nobody else in here ever experiences. But so I was kind of struck this week by how great of a responsibility we have as parents, not necessarily to save our kids, because that's God's job, and only He can do that, but to guide them in that direction, and just kind of, the weight of that responsibility. I was kind of reminded of that this week as I was preparing for class. So I'm going to say a prayer also for parents. I know we had a couple walk in. Any other prayer requests before we get going? All right, let's pray. God, we thank you so much for this beautiful day that you've blessed us with. God, there are so many prayer requests that are probably in people's heads right now that didn't verbalize them. I know that you know those, and I pray that you would honor those. God, you say that you draw near to the brokenhearted, so I'm confident that you're going to draw near to all of those today. And we especially pray that prayer for Brian and his family. I just can't imagine the frustration and just the pain and the anger and the thoughts that must be running through their heads as families and wrestling with you and with what's going on in their lives. And I pray that you would draw near to them. I know it's sometimes seems like there is no light at the end of the tunnel, but I know that you always walk with us through everything in life, and so I pray that you would walk with them through this. God, we also pray for everyone in this room as parents. It's such a huge responsibility that you've laid on us. God, thankfully you haven't left us alone to deal with it by ourselves, but you've given us each other, you've given us you, and you've given us resources through which to make this journey. So I pray today that you would speak whatever message you have planned today, and that you would open hearts and ears to hear. God, we thank you for everything you do for us, and it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so real quick, we'll hit the ground rules. Well, not those rules, more just the basics that we talk about every week. So in the cans, strips of paper, if you've got suggestions or things that you want, we've gotten, I think, down 2 so far. So if you've got any question that's burning on your mind or topic that you're struggling with, when it comes to parenting, feel free to write that on there, fold it in half, don't write your name, and we will do our best to try to work those in throughout class. Also, resources. This list is getting pretty long. I have the list of email addresses from last time. I'm probably going to refresh it one more time because I know we've got some people who are in and out to make sure I get all of them. So maybe, well, I will be gone next week, but the following week I'll try to do that and I'll print it out. So if you didn't get your email address the first go round, you can add it then. And then at the end, I'm going to catalog all these and I'll send out an email to everyone with those. And so if there are more that you'd like to add, feel free to add them. There's books, podcasts, and others. Okay, so without further ado, we will jump into sexuality. So full disclosure, there's probably going to be some conversation that's going to feel a little non-churchy maybe this morning. There will probably be words that you may not be used to hearing in church. So that's okay. That's all part of it, right?
We got that last 2 weeks.
You got that last week. That's right. You did get that last week. Yeah, we're on a roll. I needed to keep the tradition alive. All right. So to start with, and we're going to go pretty quick on this one because we got a late start, and so I want to make sure we get to the last stuff because it's the most important. But at your tables, super briefly, like 2 or 3 minutes, or your neighbor or whatever. What did your parents teach you about sex growing up? And I see some smiles and laughs because some of you may have gotten nothing, and others of you may have gotten more than you wanted to know. So go ahead and do that for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll come back together. Here we go. All right, let's bring it back together. So I bet we had the spectrum. Did we have a spectrum? Whose parents said nothing? Or next to nothing. Okay, so about 50-50, and the rest of you got a little more. I was about to use a horrible pun that I'm not going to use. We'll save that one. My wife gave me a good reminder not to say anything too embarrassing today, so I'm trying to get started on the right foot here. Okay, so why is this important? So I'm going to go through a few statistics. Down here is the reference. You can check out the website if you want. The dates of these studies, one was finished up in 2021, and then the second one, Barna Group and Covenant Eyes Survey, was November of 2020. I'm just going to throw all of these up there at once. So 56% of Christian teens in the U.S. believe that it is okay to have sex before marriage. 56%. That actually sort of surprised me. Percentage of never married Christian teens that have been sexually active by age group, 13 to 15 years old, 18%. 16 to 17 years old, 34%. And 18 to 19 years old, 53%. The average age of first exposure to porn is 11 years old, which makes me want to throw it in my mouth. And then, I don't know, different schools have different timelines for this. I know my kids go to NEISD. So in 4th grade, they have to watch the maturation, help me out with this, the maturation videos, but they watch them only of their specific gender. And then in 5th grade now, they watch them both. So the girls watch the boys, and the boys watch the girls, which that is 10 years old, right? 9 years old for the 4th grade. So what does the Bible say? So that's kind of a little bit about, obviously, why it's important to have these discussions. What does the Bible say about it? So in Leviticus, there's actually 2 different places, but in Leviticus, the Bible rolls out kind of the Jewish sexual law. Now, this was at the time they were going into the land of Canaan, right? Which we'll talk about more in a second. But I'll read Leviticus 18, 2 through 3. So I'm going to read the book in. So I'm going to give you the opening and the closing, and then I'm going to give you a brief summary of everything in between. Okay? So Leviticus 18, 2 through 3. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. Okay, so he opens with that. Then he goes through a whole bunch of do nots, right? do not have sex with animals, do not have sex with your mother, do not have sex with your mother-in-law. There's a whole list of the Levitical sexual law. And on a side note, by the way, Travis read, I think was it last week or the week before, the one about how today it's a common argument that back then they got married at 16 or 17. Now people are getting married later, so it's still not okay. Like the Levitical sexual law, one of the arguments they use for that is that Jesus never specifically says it. Well, he was talking to Jews. Every Jew knew this by heart, right? So he didn't have to reiterate the Levitical sexual law when he was actually speaking to them. Anyway, side. Now Canaan, I don't know if you're like me. Canaan, I always kind of thought was just kind of some innocent people, right? The Canaanites. I didn't really picture them as anything other than that. And so in the book of Judges, right, I think the word whore is used in the book of Judges, I don't even know the number of times, but it's used a lot, right? And it talks about people whoring after other gods. Well, I always thought that was a metaphor. I don't know if any of you were like me, right? Because, Christ is the bride, or the church is the bride of Christ, right? And so cheating on God, whoring after other gods is kind of what I thought it was. But actually, it was a literal statement. They were whoring after other gods. So in the Bible, you'll read about, there's a couple of different things that when they go into a town, they would destroy, right? One of those things was, I think they're called, if I'm saying them right, Asherah poles, if I'm saying that correctly. Those are actually phallic symbols, right? And for their gods. And they believed that in order to get good things from their gods, they needed to stimulate them. So part of what that looked like for them was church orgies, literally whoring after other gods, because that's how you won the favor of your God if you were a Canaanite back then, right? And so setting them apart meant being completely different than the culture that they were walking into and living in. Now, we're a little bit less obvious with our sexual immorality, I would say, in our culture today. We don't walk into churches and have orgies. But I would argue we're probably just as perverse, just in totally different ways, right? And the statistics show from the previous slide that our culture today is not just invading secular culture, but it's also invading Christian culture, because it's becoming more and more common, and kids more and more believing that it's okay, right? And so it brings us to sort of the challenge that we have today. So maybe the best way I can kind of give you an analogy for this. Has anybody heard the fire analogy when it comes to sex? No? Okay. So the best way maybe I can describe this is fire good or bad? That's not a literal question. I'm asking. Is fire good or bad?
Depends.
Okay, why?
Your house burns down, it's not good. If you're cold,
It's good when you're cold, yeah, right? When else is fire good?
cook something.
Cook something. Okay, keep warm, cook something. Anybody like campfires? Roasting marshmallows? It's like one of my favorite things. Sitting by a fire pit, hanging out. Forest fires, not quite so good, right? Even though I guess God uses them to replenish the earth. So if you think about that analogy, all the context, all the times when fire is good, it's within boundaries. It's within a fire pit, right? Or you have a fire break that's an intentional burn. There are no examples where fire is good where it is not within boundaries. It's not in a stove. It's not in a fireplace. It's not all things that keep it contained, right? Anytime it's bad, it's when it doesn't have boundaries, right? So in the same way, the Bible gives us the same sort of viewpoint of sex, right? God gave us this beautiful, amazing gift, and it's intended to be used and enjoyed. within specific boundaries, right? Just in the same way fire is. Okay, so the talk. And a bunch of books talk about this, right? And I'm going to share a couple of resources that I've read through. There's a bunch of them out there, and all of them are good, right? Well, you're right. I see you shaking your head. Not all of them are good. But a lot of them are good. So the first one, just do it, right? Your kids, now I would say, I think most of the studies that I read said by the age of 9, they're exposed to some sort of conversation around sexuality, which is 3rd or 4th grade, depending on the age of your child. It always, I don't know, I always felt like the conversation was going to be an awkward conversation. And so kind of just getting started is the first step, literally. And what helped was the second line, taking your time. So what this isn't in the first conversation is just vomiting every sexual fact that you know to your 3rd grader, right? You don't have to give them the entire book on the first conversation. What it looks like more, and we've only done one so far out of 3 kids, so we have more to go, but it was sort of, we would have the initial conversation, 2 or 3 days later, she would come back and ask, like, hey, you mentioned this, talk to me about that. And so it's more about opening the dialogue for it, if that makes sense, than it is giving them everything at once. And there's a whole lot of things that go into that conversation, from things that are directly sexually related to, going through puberty and what that's like, right? There's a whole lot of things that kind of go into that conversation. But you'll also find opportunities along the way to reinforce and further that conversation. So maybe you're watching a TV show. As you know, TV shows have done a lot to try to desensitize us to sex, right? So maybe you're watching something like that and you see something that gives you a good opportunity to further that discussion. Or maybe you're having a conversation about modesty and because of something you saw somebody wearing or whatever. Like there are times, if you're paying attention, that those doors are open for you to continue those conversations. And the next thing is resources. So I will say probably the number one resource for us was the people in this room. I think you've been placed here intentionally. You've been placed in this church intentionally. I can say, Kristen my wife is very good at this. I think she probably called 8 or 9 people to ask about how to do this the first go around. In fact, Travis's wife gave her this book, which is the one she used. Again, there's more than one good one, but this is the one that it kind of walks you through conversations. This is a good resource. This book, which I know there are some more back here, is a good one also. I kind of spent some time flipping through it when I came and redid the class setup this week. And it has some really good information too, directly. It even has some exercises, I think, in there that you can do like at the end of the chapters with kids. So it's a really good one as well. There are a ton of resources out there. But whichever resource you choose, I think the most important thing is to start having the dialogue. And then share your experiences as appropriate. What I mean by that is some of you may have, as teenagers and young adults, some of you, this may have been difficult for. And it was really difficult for you to wait. Some of you may have not been able to wait, right? And I think sharing those experiences, obviously at an age, you don't need to go tell your, 3rd grader about every sin you ever committed, but sharing those experiences along the way, I think helps them see you as someone who they can talk to about these things, like a real person. You're not just, this, perfect person who never struggled with this. No, you're somebody who they can come and say, hey, I'm really struggling here. I like John, or I like, Sally, and, this is hard. And you want them talking to you about those things, obviously. And I think sharing those experiences gets you there. So I want to take a minute and I want to open it up. We're not going to do this at the table because I don't know that we're going to have time if I'm going to get to everything today. But for those of you who've had the talk, any advice that I didn't put on this slide that you'd give out? Come on, don't be shy.
As far as terminology, like, especially when they're younger, introducing words to them instead of having them introduced at school or with friends at other people's houses is always better. And it is so hard to say some of those words to your children, but making sure they hear them from you and understand what that means and understand that's not a word we use or this is how it's used is very important.
There's actually even research that says doing that from a young age reduces their risk of being sexually abused by other people. Because if an adult with ill intentions knows that this child knows the correct terminology for those body parts, they are much less likely to push boundaries on it.
It's almost, as I've read about it, it's almost like, so back in the day, I had a family member who was adopted, one of my cousins, and, there wasn't a whole lot of research done at the time about, what to do with parents who adopted, how do you talk about it, when do you talk about it, so they never told him until he was like a teenager. And it created this whole identity crisis for him as he was older. Fast forward, we have an adopted child, and one of the things that you have to actually agree to in order to adopt is that you are going to tell them about it all the time from when you get them. And in some ways, I think this conversation is a little bit like that, right? I think making it, in the Church of Christ, let's be honest, like, probably not just the Church of Christ, probably churches in general, this topic is sort of taboo, right? We don't spend a whole lot of time talking about pornography and sex and oral sex and all these other things, right? We don't spend a lot of time talking about that. But I think it's important in appropriate doses to make this a more normative conversation with them throughout time instead of something that's like, oh, hey, by the way, 13-year-old, like, this is what this is for, right? Because I think then it becomes, a much more difficult conversation.
Well, there's really, in my opinion, no way to not talk about it with movies and music that they're listening to. We take every opportunity to, almost every movie you watch. And we don't just watch, we have older kids, so we don't just watch the cartoon movies, we watch the other movies too. And there's no way to really avoid it. There is always an opportunity to say something, talk about, hey, did you remember this was going on?
Yeah. No, you're right. It's almost unavoidable. And I think it's, in a lot of ways, desensitized us to it somewhat, which is dangerous, but
You think it's going to be awkward, and it is awkward at the beginning, but, if they read the Bible in 2 Samuel, they're coming up to us in the 4th grade, 5th grade class. What's rape? What's, why is he sleeping with his, daughter or whatever? You just can't.
Yeah, the Bible is definitely not rated PG.
What's a virgin? These things.
Why did they kill all of them but the virgins? I don't understand.
Sometimes if you find yourself or you see that your kids are super nervous to talk about what they think about it, asking them, what are you hearing from school? What are your friends talking about this? And that kind of gives them a way to talk about it without, like, not incriminating themselves, but they don't have to they don't have to talk about what they think they can rat somebody else out. They're a lot more my kids are quicker to do that than,
Yeah.
than
No.
that. And then, as they get older, I think a really important conversation we've had with our older two as they've been in dating relationships is what boundaries are you guys setting together? What have you talked about together? Again, just asking those questions so that they have control over it, in a sense, and they know that they are the ones to take initiative to set those boundaries. So asking those questions about their friends and then about their relationships in a way that doesn't just come across as preaching, but in a way that encourages dialogue.
Yeah.
Keeping the dialogue open that we started so many years ago, now it feels like, and then puts them in charge of themselves that they have to be.
No, absolutely. And actually, that's a perfect segue. Because sort of this first conversation, it's a little awkward, but it's really not rocket science. There's not a whole class worth of stuff that we could just spend talking about this conversation. And so I think it really gets tougher as they get older, but the most important thing here is starting. And so I just want to, I can't say that one enough. Like, open the dialogue and begin the conversation wherever you are, right? Maybe you haven't said a word. Great. Like, today's a great day. Just start the dialogue. So some of these I'm gonna run through a little bit quickly. Others I'm gonna spend a little bit more time. But there's 11 that I sort of came up with, and this isn't a perfect list by any stretch of the imagination. So there may be others that I'm omitting or things on here that you're like, I don't know if that would make sense. But these are sort of the 11 that, as I read most about, these were the most common things to talk to your kids about over time, right? So number one is sex pleases God. He created it. If you read the Song of Solomon, obviously he created it to be enjoyed. There's rivaling peaks of the Himalayas and all the other stuff in Song of Solomon. And I think that's important, and it goes along, I think, with the second one, which is sex is amazing. I think in an effort over the years, especially in the past, and probably more so in my time, I think in an effort to try to protect our kids and keep them from making mistakes in this area, we sort of told them that it was bad. And we demonized sex. Demonize is probably a strong word, but we made it seem like sex was not a good, God-given thing. This has had psychological consequences on so many kids as they got married. Because it is so hard on that night when you've been told all your life that this is bad to turn the switch and all of a sudden it's okay and it's good. That your brain doesn't work that way. If some of you may have even experienced this. Like, psychologically, it screws with you if you think something's horrible and then all of a sudden, boom, it's supposed to be okay now. Like, how does that work? So I think it's important for them to understand that this is a good gift and it is wonderful. Just like the fire analogy, within the correct boundaries that God created it for. And we're going to spend some time talking about why those boundaries are there, because those are in the other ones. But I think this is an important point, because I know as a child, that's kind of how I felt, was that sex was like this bad thing that I had to stay away from, or I was going to get, burned. So the third thing, sex is to be a sign of a covenant between two people. This is sort of an odd thing, so I'm going to preface this in the front end. Like, I had trouble actually digesting this one, but everything I read talked about, and there's different verses in the Bible that I could quote. I don't have time this morning, but that I could quote, but that talk about how sex is actually intended to point us towards what our union with Christ is going to be like in heaven, which back then, I guess, was seen as more of a common thing because of the way religion and sex were much more connected. Today, that seems weird. I don't know how else to say that, right? It felt weird when I was reading it, like, I don't know. But, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I read says that covenant relationship and sex is really pointing you towards what that union with Christ will, the euphoria that will come with that. And then I'm going to spend a little time on this last one. Sex is designed to make you one with your partner. So, when you first held your child or multiple children, if you have more than one, do you remember the feeling? Yes? I hope so. Do you, yes? Everybody? Yes. Yes. Okay, so that chemical, right, that produces that feeling in you. There's two of them, primarily. There's more than two. But the two chemicals that produce that feeling are oxytocin and vasopressin. Okay? And those are the primary chemicals in the brain that are responsible for bonding, like bonding you to someone or something. Okay? There's a third chemical involved when you have sex, and specifically when you have an orgasm, and that's dopamine. Everybody probably has heard of dopamine. Dopamine is the pleasure chemical in the brain. Like, that's the reason so many people wait for their likes on Facebook, right? Because every time you get that like on Facebook, you get that hit of dopamine. Some of you may know this because you may be list takers and you go to the grocery store and you forgot to write something on your list, and you write it down just so you can cross it off. Has anybody ever done that, right? Well, the reason you're doing that is because that gives you that hit of dopamine, right? All of these chemicals are the same chemicals involved in sex. So when you have an orgasm, those three chemicals actually bond you to whoever or whatever you are with at that point in time. And the reason I say whatever is because this is one of the things that makes pornography so dangerous. Because actually what happens, and I'm not going to get into it because next week's part 2 where we get more into perversions of sexuality, but what actually happens is they get overloaded with dopamine hits when you are involved with pornography. And it actually, your body begins to shut down the receptors that create that pleasure from the dopamine. And when that happens, you need more and more and more and more and more to feel it. That's why pornography and depression are so strongly linked, because it actually shuts your ability to enjoy things down. But it's really neat, though, to me, that God physically created us to strengthen our bonds with our spouse through sex. Because what is intended to happen is these chemicals are intended to come, and when you have sex with your husband or wife, it's intended to make that relationship stronger and reinforce that bond through that process, right? Okay. Sorry, I got a little soapboxy on that one.
I just want to say something.
Yes, sir.
What's really interesting is there's studies that are just coming out, but the opposite is true, right? When you have multiple partners, exactly with dopamine, the ability to create a deep bond with somebody, you lose them.
100%.
It's just been shown, that if you have multiple partners for your lifespan, it's more and more difficult as you age for that bond.
Yeah, I think they call it bond breaking. Does that sound right? Like, basically, like you're training your brain. These chemicals and these reactions are supposed to, they're created in order to create the bond. And so through pornography and through sex with multiple partners, you train your brain to break those bonds, that those bonds are not supposed to be reinforced. And so it makes it actually more difficult later in life when you go to get married to have a strong bond because you've broken the bond so many times. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. It's a great point. Which is perfect timing, right? Sex outside of marriage steals your joy and quenches the Spirit's leading. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but how many of you have sinned? Just generically. Please raise your hand. Otherwise, I need to teach a whole different class. Okay? When you sin breaks that connection with God. Now, I'm not talking about grace and forgiveness here. Obviously, those things are true, but that kind of goes back to my comment a few weeks ago about don't live your life in the dark, right? And teach your kids not to live their life in the dark, because sin is so pervasive and can destroy your relationship with God over time. And so having that connection with your you're, well, I'm going to say that because I'm going to run my point on the next slide. So we'll just leave that alone. How far is too far? So this goes right, this is, you stole my point, right? How far is too far? So this is kind of something I know I definitely never talked about as a kid with my parents. But what's okay? And I'm not going to define this for you because I think this is probably going to be a different conversation for each person slightly. But I think this is important to have this conversation, right? Because I think what happens is a lot of times good, well-intentioned kids put themselves in situations and they say, well, we're just going to sit in the car and make out, right? Okay. But then they get in that moment, and when you're an adolescent, you don't have the self-control that you have when you're an adult. And so what happens, right? Then you end up going farther than you wanted or intended to go. And I can tell you, and I'm talking everything, right? Like, I would have the conversation, like, what's okay? Is kissing okay? Is touching okay? Is oral sex the same thing as real sex? I think these things are important to have conversations with your kids about along the way, right? You're not going to have that conversation with a third grader. But as to your point, as they get older into the teenage years, I mean, this is stuff they're going to be faced with. It just is. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay.
I was about to say when you mentioned age, but it's not too early to say how far is too far to make your limit. If someone else is lying or if they take something that doesn't belong to them, are you going to go along with that? Like, what kind of boundary do you place for yourself in that kind of area? So you can start to teach that boundary, like where their boundary is, and as you go up in age, then bring it closer and closer to the subject. As they get to 7th grade, then start to talk about, more along the lines of personal body or personal space, and then, bring it closer and closer home to the subject. So when they're little, we can still use that concept, which is a really great one.
Yeah.
So thanks for pointing that out, because it's a really good concept.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe some of you had parents who had discussions with you about that, but I never knew what was okay, right? And then physical consequences. This is kind of the obvious one that we tend to. This is our go-to, right? And it is important to talk to them about it. I'm just not going into this one a ton because I think most of you probably have a pretty good concept of what those physical consequences are. We kind of already hit on this one a little bit, but pornography is sex. And what I mean by that, and I'll give you a little teaser because I think this topic is going to come up next week, but 69% of pastors, this is from that same study that I referenced earlier, 69% of pastors report that porn has adversely impacted their church. 57% of them say porn addiction is the most damaging issue in their congregation. 70% of youth pastors have had teens come to them for help in dealing with porn in the past year. I already talked about the average first stage of exposure. This one makes me sick. 94% of kids will have viewed porn by age 14. This is a really big, I don't know how else to describe it. It's a really big problem and a really big issue. And I would venture to say that probably at least 60 to 70% of our church has been impacted by this issue, whether it's directly or indirectly. It's just a big issue. And it's something that you have to get a handle on with your kids, because if you don't, they're going to get it from somewhere else. They just are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Last week I talked about a little bit about what pornography does psychologically. Interestingly enough, most of the time it's not about, most of the time people are doing it, it's not about the actual physical act of, seeing the other person in the video. They're actually doing it to self-soothe themselves. It's really not that much different than an alcohol addiction or a drug addiction in that way, because it's really because they're unhappy in some other area or they can't reconcile some other area of their life. So really it kind of starts with becoming whole before, anyway, we'll get into that. This one too I think is super important. You can be pure again. um, just statistically speaking, and this makes me sad to say, but statistically speaking, some of our children are going to make mistakes in this area. It's just, the odds are against us as parents. And I think it's really important as a parent that your kids understand that if they do make a mistake, not that that's okay, but that you will forgive them, that God can forgive them, and that they can start again and be whole again. Because if you don't, I think what tends to happen is they make one mistake and they hide it in the dark, just like every other sin. And once they hide it in the dark, it begins to erode away at their insides. And then in order to continue to hide it, they do it again. And then they make another mistake, and then they make another mistake. And as long as it never comes out of the dark, they continue to spiral down, right? So I think it's important for you to have the conversation with your kids that if a mistake happens, I love you. I want to be there for you. I want to help you through it, right? Because then they come to you when it happens, and you can help them guide through it, right? This is something, too, I think we haven't necessarily done a great job of because we want to draw such a hard line there. And I understand why, but it's important for your kids to know that you will forgive them and that God can forgive them. And then the last one is, it's possible to wait. Now, our society would tell you that's nuts. Society today, in fact, if you read a lot of the national guidelines for kids' education, it's really no longer is it really about healthy relationships. It's actually switched to consent. Everything's about consent. So exploration is okay, and in fact good, as long as there is consent from the other party involved. That's essentially what your kids will be taught throughout high school. And, it's true that marriage has gotten later and later, so I think this has become a more and more difficult thing to address. But it is possible to wait through God's grace and mercy. It's possible to succeed in fending off pornography in your kids' lives. It is possible. Sometimes it seems impossible because it's just so pervasive in our society, but it is possible. And I think talking to your kids about that, and this is true of lots of other sins too, right? It's not just this one. But, so I think we're pretty close to on time. So what I want to end with today is, and I shortened it a little bit because we were a little late in getting started, but I want you to share with your table members where you're at in these conversations with your kids about sex and what do you need to discuss next. Don't be shy about this. Like, every parent in here has been at different places in these conversations. So if you're at ground zero, fantastic. Like, have those conversations because there's parents along the way who've already been through them. If you're, in the middle of the worst of it, talk about that. But God gave us these, your fellow parents, to help you through these times. I think it's important to use each other to continue to drive these conversations. So, go.
We're working out here.
You're in the negative. We're in the tunnel.
That's a good place to start.
I mean, I would too. And teach
Very much.
And then one day we actually we tried to hear it. Get that going.
Our oldest daughter, seriously, getting ready for clothes. Like, I found myself telling her to, like, she was so fun.
Yeah.
I feel like that. More so.
They did that until this used to be about puberty or whatever. And we already like this is and she said that she didn't want anything like she never really it was just about like it's like we got the courage and I did so do you have any questions? Like not like that, but I don't know what to say about that. I like
That's awesome.
You know, I'll find my daughter as well. And my wife more than that.
And after we talk about certain things in that area, the options that feel like
that's kind of the way
no, or at night when I'm in the I don't know, people would be like, tell me all of it.
All right. 2 seconds. You guys are more than welcome to keep the table conversations going after class. But I just wanted to kind of give us some official closure this morning. All right, thank you. So thank you guys for being here today. I hope this was helpful. I'm praying for all of you. You know, it's a lot easier to teach this stuff than it is to actually do it, if I'm being honest. So I know what you're going through. So go have a great week. You can continue your conversations, pick up your kiddos, do whatever you need to do. I won't be here next week. Travis will have the reins. And then I will be here the next week, and then Ben is going to come in and do a two-weeker on technology. So, yeah, we'll be good. But thank you guys. Thanks for being here.
like